Hello, this is Derek Arden and welcome to Monday Night Live. This is the second session with Justin Urquhart-Steward, and I've been collecting all your questions, and we've got some questions coming through which will be very interesting. I hope you can handle them, Justin. I think you should fasten your seatbelt because we're nearly ready for takeoff. Oxygen masks at the ready. A grocer called Morrison.
I saw this one of it.
Sorry, a grocer called Morrisons is worth £6.3 billion, and Amazon might bid for them. What's going on?
It is astonishing, isn't it? That's a classic case, you see, a lovely old value business, cash generating business, rather different from a lot of the other supermarkets. Remember, they do tend to go right from actually pulling things out of the ground, getting the sods off, and to processing them and selling them. And same also, they have their own fishing boats as well. So they're sort of vertically integrated. And they've got a good property base as well. But you see, because the London market was being rather shunned because it didn't have the level of technology fashion stocks that we saw in NASDAQ and the rest of the US markets. And so that, and with a certain amount of cloud of Brexit as well, because I can't see what's happening next, these companies were often being ignored. So it's hardly surprising the private equity firms with access, of course, to very, very cheap money, you virtually have to pay nil for it, to actually go and buy assets. Now, some of these private equity firms, the first one that was approaching them, I was rather suspicious about. The next lot is interesting. They've got shareholders in the one of the big Canadian pension funds, and they have a much longer term view on investing. So they might be the more positive white knight private equity firms as opposed to the black knight asset strippers. But as we were saying a little earlier, with Bisselbrook about the issue of their fees, these people are fee junkies, and so they love doing the deals, and their bonuses will be fantastic. So they'll be looking for anything else they can try and buy. Therefore, all the more reason that we give more capital to businesses to enable them to grow rather than just get sold off.
Okay, I'm going to go to the questions now. We talked about inflation in part one. Andrew's just said his flight to Newcastle has gone up by 40% recently. Does that mean we're going to have 40% inflation?
I'm pleased to hear that there's a flight to Newcastle still. And the answer at the moment, they will be doing their best to try and actually get money in to survive. Yes, those costs will go up, I think, very significantly indeed. And they go up like a rocket and come down like a feather. And also with those flights to Newcastle, there's normally not much competition. For those who may remember the days of the BA shuttle and you had British Midland, you had really competitive prices and really good services. They were doing their best to try and get you there. You knew when you're flying British Midland, they employed the fighter pilots because when you got near Glasgow, they sort of dived into it, whereas the BA people also employed the bomber pilots who came down a lot slower. But what it meant was that price was good pricing competition. Where we're finding now much less competition, those prices will go up. And that's what BA played a very clever game, whether you like BA or not. And I have to say their management has not always been the most likable. They restructured their cabin staff. Well, when I mean that, I don't mean what they look like, but in terms of their pay, which is the euphemism for cutting it, their pilots, and it's the same things. In terms of financing the planes, restructured their debt, and got a lot of cash very cheaply. So they know when we come out of this at the other end, where's the competition? And the answer is still there, but with high cost bases, and BA finds themselves in a long position. So therefore, the price of flights to Newcastle are going to come down anytime soon. If there's more volume coming through and some competition, the answer is yes. But that's a good example of where you're going to see further price push coming through.
Adam asks, with insolvencies at historical low levels, furlough coming to an end, landlords unable to take any action until next March, do you envisage a tsunami of business failures?
At the moment, you've got banks who are very, very sensitive after the banking crisis and the reputation of being on the front page of the Daily Mail. Bankers are never very popular. No, much more likely is you're going to find these banks actually finding themselves with a load of zombie companies on the basis that they're never really going to be able to change. They require further financing, but they can't afford to let them go bust. So the zombies just there devouring more bank capital. And the banks will eventually have to turn around and say they're going to have to cut it, but it could cost them quite a lot of money to do so. So I think you're going to find as we come out of this, there will be a lot of bad debts or companies failing. And out of that, though, you always need to have that going through that process. Remember, this started before the pandemic when you had the likes of Jamie Oliver and Canuccio's going bust. two private equity examples. They were going to go down because their leverage was far too high, and they were going to get squeezed. So we're going to see a lot more of that coming through, and a lot of it's going to be dependent on bank attitude, in terms of also the financial controls and regulatory issues, but also primarily bank capital.
Gabrielle asks, the regional investment hub sounds like a practical and common sense idea, but who do you see regulating it?
Thank you. I hope it is a common sense idea. I regard it, as John Cleese would have preferred it no more, as the bleeding obvious, which is why I find it frustrating in London, because London doesn't want to do it. For the reason that Rob Misselbrook said earlier, because they are all on their deals and fees. So how does it get regulated? The answer is, well, through the regulator. FCA will be there and making sure it's properly regulated. And also, the key issue for me with this is also constricting the type of investors. That does not mean you have to be snooty over it all. What it means is you're trying to take on investors who have a better understanding of risk, people who are able to sign themselves off as being a professional investor. I'm quite sure the definition of that is still unclear, but basically willing to understand that they are taking a risk here. And so not having widows and orphans in there, which I fear is what you've been seeing in the crowdfunding world, and there's going to be a lot of pain coming out of that for people who were expecting apparently good returns coming through, and now finding there are going to be no returns coming through. So yes, regulation must be absolutely crucial. You've got to make sure you get the right businesses on there as well, and not a bunch of those flash companies coming through. Some people may remember there was an old Vancouver Stock Exchange that focused on particularly mining companies in Canada, and got itself a terrible reputation, with the unfortunate habit of losing the odd geologist who was responsible for understanding the quality of the uranium. And that's the habit of falling out of helicopters in Indonesia, but that's another story. So regulation is going to be crucial, because good regulation is actually good for a market. And it's not something, it's only the people who don't like regulation is because actually they feel they don't need to have it. Markets need good regulation, practical regulation.
Fantastic. Alex asks, if I was to suggest to my clients they consider regionally, what sort of hoops would they have to go through to get financial investment compared with other routes?
Very straightforward indeed, in terms of actually being able to get onto the platform, looking at the companies that are there, those with the right sort of structure in terms of type of business they want to have. When I say type of structure, and this is the key issue I know that Rob Misselbrook's done with a lot of his companies, making them investable, making sure they're not just mum and dad, mum and pop companies, or some chap just with a good idea that's been going for a while, but ones which have got a proper structure to them, a plan, a view as to where they're going. So making sure that you've actually got those right sort of businesses, right sort of businesses in there. So constrict the investors to the right caliber, and make sure you've got the quality of businesses in there. Well, even that means you've got less businesses in there. So for investors coming in, they can go on the platform, see the companies, have they got the right tax wrappers, EISs and things like that they need to have for that. You must always take independent advice on this, of course, but understanding the risk of the fact these aren't startups. These are growing businesses. They've all got a track record, which in many ways is much more attractive to me than punting on a startup where you have there is no track record, and it's just a broken record of people going around trying to raise money the entire time.
John asks, John's in Paris, although he's left us. He says one possible outcome of Brexit is London will slowly become less and less international and possibly more attracted by regional investment. But I read on the front page of the Financial Times on Saturday that we've overtaken Amsterdam again as a trading centre. So what's going on there? Is it all good news? We've left the EU? Well,
it's good news and bad news. We were by far and away the largest financial centre in the EU. And of course, the likes of Berlin and Paris and Amsterdam were very keen to get their hands on this if they possibly could. And therefore, by coming out of it, we have been losing. We lose European trading. It goes over to the continent, and that's why Amsterdam actually took us over. What those main centres don't have is the integration of all the elements that go towards financial services. Forgive me for wandering around the City of London, but you've got Lloyds for insurance, you've got all the different banking structures in there, you've got the general insurance side as well, and you've also got more specific, more tailored investment structures as well, and funds, as well as the usual wealth managers and stockbrokers. So there's a much greater depth there than you'll find in other centres. What London has to do is to show itself as being back to what it was before, an international market. The FTSE 100, remember, over 60% of those companies in the FTSE 100 are not operating in the UK. They operate elsewhere. Some have been rather dubious Central Asian mining companies, or most of those have gone now. But London has to clean its act up with regard to money laundering and such structures. It put itself a bad reputation for that. But actually go out and market itself. You have to market a market to actually say, here is a good liquid base to invest your, to raise your capital and have your companies listed here. It's interesting that Bridgepoint at the weekend were also talking about the possibility of a £6 billion float. Bridgepoint, big private equity firm, and they want to do it in London because it's not America. Because America see everything just through American eyes, and investment is just American. London is international. And much more international than Paris or Berlin or even Amsterdam. And so London, and I hate the comparison because it's nothing like it at all, when you hear some dumb politician saying, we should be the Singapore of the West. Singapore is a small, very successful economy. And we're never going to be that at all in that same sort of scale. But we've got great strength, which we can actually use. And so we should make ourselves as competitive as the likes of Singapore. So to that extent, yes, we should become the Singapore of the West, but not in the format that some people are thinking of.
Great. And on a rather negative note, but one we must go to, Nancy says her concern is that China may try to take Taiwan, which holds a large amount of US debt. What chaos would that create? But I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it, or not?
Well, we said it was ridiculous. We saw Russia taking over some of its neighbours, nibbling away at their borders, South Ossetia and things like that, but also Crimea, just openly, brazenly, just grabbing hold of that, and the West saying, oh dear, that's a pity, and really that's not much a reaction. But Russia's a smaller scale issue. That is quite right. China is a key, very important issue. It's a key leader in terms of financing the world. But I mentioned before about G7. Remember, they're the wealthiest nations by capita. If you look at the US, it's around about $50,000 per American citizen. You look at China, it's around about $3,500 per Chinese citizen. So in terms of wealth across the country, it is a huge difference overall. The issue over Taiwan is very, very dangerous indeed. Previously, the Chinese have looked to try and actually do a Hong Kong, one country, two systems. Well, we know how that ended up. And the Taiwanese, even some of the Taiwanese do want to go, maybe join back with China, but still a minority doing so. But the Americans will make sure this is a line that one of their red lines that they don't want to be crossed. And that's one of the reasons you're going to be seeing our fleet going between Taiwan, or the fleet going between Taiwan and the mainland China, just to actually prove the situation that actually that Taiwan does have support. And Nancy also add to that very same point, the South China Seas, where the Chinese claim 200 miles territorial waters around something known as the Red Dot Line, which basically mean territorial waters extend virtually down to Malaysia. Funnily enough, that's rather upset Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, and the Philippines, and Vietnam. It's quite clever to manage to piss all those off at once. So that is a very sensitive issue. Thank God we don't have Trump, because this requires careful diplomacy, and particularly the Chinese not shouting at one another, but actually doing this quietly and sensibly over time. It's not in China's interest economically to be able to have a go at Taiwan. It's a political issue. The question is to what extent Xi thinks he's strong enough to be able to go with something like that and not find themselves being pushed into issues such as a war, albeit maybe fought by proxy elsewhere. And I don't think he wants to do that.
We got a Trump question in the box. If Trump is convicted for tax fraud or unable to meet his repayment obligations, will that have a wider impact on business, or can we enjoy it just as a spectator sport? I like that.
It is a hell of a spectator sport. It's dreadful, isn't it? Because that's not how we should be dealing with American politics, but it has been quite astonishing. The issue with this is going to be that so far he hasn't been indicted at all. Only some of the members of the Trump organization, and certainly it'll be catching up with him in terms of tax evasion, avoidance, whatever. So I think the truth will come out eventually. But of course, remember, what he's been very good at being able to do is to be able to actually just say it's fake news, and an awful lot of people will believe him. So does that have a broader impact on business? The answer is no, because financially he isn't that powerful. How rich is he? Not that rich. What will happen is if he is indicted for something, and maybe not him, but also various key members, that may well create a breach in some of the loans that are out there, and particularly the likes of Deutsche Bank, who for some reason found themselves far too close to them. And therefore, those breaches will demand immediate repayment. And of course, being in the property market, they won't be able to do that. So would Trump therefore go to the market to borrow some more? Well, who's going to lend it to him? And the answer is nobody. So it was bad news for Trump, but in terms of the broader investment market, broader banking market, apart from pain for Deutsche Bank and maybe one or two other losers, no, it's not going to have that broader effect. It ain't as important as the headlines would have us believe. But on the other hand, it's a cracking good story.
Did I read that he's still the Republican candidate for 2024? Is that right?
Well, he hasn't formally said that yet. But what he is doing is everybody's going down to Mar-a-Lago to go and kiss the ring, because his apparently 70 million voters would obviously people that would be persuaded for the next congressional and Senate elections coming up in 2 years. And so therefore, all of the Republicans want to be seen to be going after those 70 million and therefore inheriting some of them from Trump. At the moment, Trump, he thinks he controls 70 million. Of course, he doesn't. But for the time being, he still has a huge amount of influence. When the court cases start catching up with him, I think some of that may change as people then start to see financially exactly what he's like in terms of being an outrageous liar and a con man and a grifter.
I'm going to throw open now to people who want to ask questions. If you could give me a wave and make your questions just in short, sharp and specific, that would be absolutely brilliant. So who's going to be the first person to wave at me? Harry.
Yes, hi, Justin. Two questions. First of all, I'm surprised that no one's gone for the Honda facility or the ex-Honda facility in Swindon. One would have thought that someone from battery building would go there. And the second thing is comments about rare metals in Cornwall, etc. They're beginning to consider mining for them, etc. What are your thoughts?
I think, well, first of all, I think it's a great shame, obviously, Honda have decided to pull out. And if you're talking about actually having more battery developers, and we need more, although we're pleased with what's happened in happening in Sunderland, other initiatives in Ellesmere Port, we're nowhere near the scale of what the Germans are currently planning with it. So there would be a good opportunity to be able to pick up some of the workforce. And it wasn't just the workforce that had been there for some time, much longer than Toyota and Nissan. So it would be a real waste to actually lose that technical expertise. And we know what should be replacing them because it's being replicated elsewhere in terms of the battery plants and such like. Second part of the question, I've just forgotten, I'm sorry.
Rare metals in Cornwall,
rare metals, exactly. And of course, interesting, because one of the largest supplier of rare metals is, of course, China. And that's one of the big issues that we've got in terms of China could actually be a very significant constrictor of providing these assets. So that's a serious concern in terms of people's supply chain. And as you mentioned, therefore, lithium and in Cornwall, and I'm no expert in this, but I understand you drill down and you actually extract the lithium from the water rather than necessarily having to formally mine it. But I'm sure I'm probably going to be picked up as being totally wrong there. But nonetheless, they've got a great history of mining there, as we all know, because we watched Poldark. And there have been lots of the ideas of trying to bring tin mining back and things like that. But certainly, the likes of lithium, there is a demand for it. And if you can find other supplies for rare metals, then they will be leapt on to make sure that there are alternatives to China.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Harry. Who's next? I'm looking for a hand. No hands. You've blown them all away, Justin, with all your succinct answers, getting through usually about 2 hours worth of material in about an hour at your usual breakneck speed.
There's no hands. Does no hands mean no Germans? I never quite understand that one.
I don't know. No, don't mention the war, please. Whatever you do. We're no John Cleese sketches at this point. With no other questions, Justin, I'd like to ask you to stay online for a little while just to have a chat with us, but I'd just like to close this thanking you so much. Thank you for Freya for organising it, and I hope you'll join us back on a Monday Night Live in the autumn. Justin Urquhart-Steward, thank you so much for joining us.
Derek, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege, and good luck to everybody in whatever your finance is going to be like. I hope they're going to get better.